From London, the National Broadcasting Company presents War Telescope with John McVane of NBC's London staff, a veteran reporter of the European scene. For his regular Saturday report, we take you now to London.
This is John McVane in London. The recent reports reaching here from America again seem to emphasize certain differences between frontline troops who are doing the fighting and at least some of the politicians and other people at home. Later in this broadcast, you'll be hearing something of an episode in the life of a man of the front line, a naval flyer. Yet I wonder whether anyone who has not undergone his experience can understand it completely. The reports that I mentioned indicate one great danger to American national life, that people at home will shut their eyes to the fact that any sacrifice they can make can never be as great as the sacrifice of the frontline soldier when he risks his life. Once convince the soldier, who at this moment stands in danger of death on the Italian front or in the air over Germany, that people at home do not realize how much he's been through, and you formed at least one basis for post-war disunity within the country. Lowe, the British cartoonist, put it very well this week. He showed a Colonel Blimp clad only in a bath towel running along the beach of a Pacific island. The figure was labeled American Blimp. At the edge of the jungle were American troops ready to attack the enemy. They were looking with mingled contempt and surprise at Blimp, who was clasping his hands to his side and saying, "Help, help, I've been wounded in the pocketbook." Your average soldier doing a frontline job doesn't have much time to read newspapers or listen to news broadcasts. He knows only the general outlines of some of the main news from home. What he's heard from home in these past few weeks hasn't been news of a kind calculated to instill him with any enthusiasm for the tribulations of the home front. Lowe's cartoon may well describe the general impression of an American soldier who heard only the bald fact that Congress, by a rousing majority, decided to call on the nation to pay only a small fraction of the war expenses. As far as the soldier knows, the reason was that Congress didn't like paying for the war because it was the president's idea. As far as one can determine, the average American soldier in active service does not approve strikes by labor. Neither does he approve a congressional policy of no control of prices and salaries. Complaints about high taxes and demands for higher salaries are apt to leave the soldier, living on sea rations in a cold foxhole that's under shell fire, comparatively unmoved. He knows what his salary is going to be for some time to come, provided he lives long enough to spend it. As regards the reports about the soldier's vote, the soldier is not at the moment vitally interested in politics, but his general impression is that the president and some other people wanted to fix it so he could vote, and then his own elected representatives in Congress turned thumbs down on the idea. The soldier wasn't terribly anxious to vote, but he's left with the feeling that somehow the home front politicians have gypped him. On the question of post-war aims, the soldier hears from time to time reports that some senator or other is working himself into a lather about American air bases all over the world, oil pipelines in Arabia, and similar subjects. Occasionally he may read in his local paper a blast against America's allies, Russia and Britain. It's all very confusing to the soldier. He's beginning to be convinced that the goodwill of the people of other nations is well worthwhile. On the Italian front, he realizes that unless the French battalion on his right and the British on his left hold firm, his own fate is settled. If he flies a Fortress, he may owe his life to a British Spitfire. He knows that without the Russians, his chances of success would be very slim. Things like goodwill, qualities such as self-sacrifice and international understanding are beginning to be something more than phrases to the soldier. Yet few echoes of this state of mind return to him from the home front. It would be unfortunate if the frontline soldier were to get the impression that American national thinking has not risen above simple acquisitiveness in his absence. It would be equally unfortunate if he were to come home with the impression that his elected representatives had not treated him fairly. In either case, the soldier's resentment would enlarge the gap between himself and those who spent the war in America. The distinction of battling Japanese in the Pacific and Germans in the Atlantic is one that few American fighting men have yet enjoyed. Today I've brought to talk to you an American naval flyer who's done just that. He's Lieutenant Kenneth Wright of Burlington, Kansas. He's one of the U.S. Navy pilots who take off from British bases and sweep over the Atlantic in a long, lonely hunt for German submarines and surface vessels. For many days, no sight of the enemy may break the monotony of the air sweep. But when things do happen, they happen fast, and Lieutenant Wright's last flight was his most exciting and dangerous of the war. But to begin from the beginning, when were you in the Pacific, Lieutenant?
I was out there from September 1942 to January 1943, flying a Catalina from a base in the New Hebrides.
Looking for submarines?
Yes, but our main job was to hunt the Japanese fleet, but we never did find it.
Did you run into any air combat?
On my first operational flight, we ran into a Japanese four-motored seaplane. We came up behind him and started firing, but he peppered us with 20-millimeter cannon shells and got away.
Did you see much of the war out there?
When the U.S. Naval Task Force met the Japanese Task Force at the end of November, we sat on a hill in Tulagi and saw the whole fight taking place a few miles offshore. Next morning, we flew out and spotted survivors for our PT boats.
Well, when did you shift over to this theater of operations?
I spent a few months last summer flying in the North Atlantic Patrol from Newfoundland. Then we came to Britain. Our U.S. Naval Squadron works as a part of the British Coastal Command. There are only a few Britishers at our particular base, but most of us at this station are Americans. We also see a lot of Polish and Czech fires from time to time.
I know that your flights last many hours and take you far away from any land in the Bay of Biscay. Do you meet many enemy planes down there?
Yes, we ran into quite a lot of enemy aircraft opposition at the very beginning. The Bay of Biscay is still no picnic when anything from 2 to 16 German long-range fighters are after you. We usually see them first and manage to get into the clouds. You see, our job is to attack submarines, not to try to fight it out with German fighters.
Mm-hmm. You've had credit for sinking at least one submarine, haven't you?
3 planes got the credit, and we were one of the 3. A British searchlight plane first spotted a German submarine at night. The submarine submerged and escaped. But the next morning, another aircraft found and attacked the U-boat on the surface. That plane was so badly shot up by the sub's anti-aircraft fire that it couldn't drop its bombs. We saw a submarine at 8 miles away and dove on it with our guns going. The submarine was putting up anti-aircraft fire, but we weren't hit. We made 2 bombing stacks and left the sub down by the stern. Another liberator followed and attacked the submarine with machine guns. He watched the sub sink and survivors escape. Our squadron has had several brushes with U-boats. The German fighters, though, seem to come in streaks. You'll make your patrols without seeing any for a while. Then for a couple of weeks, you see them regular. It may be just the way it happens.
What about this last flight? How did it begin?
Well, we were just finishing our patrol. We had already been out more than 10 hours, and we were about 100 miles from land. We were flying at 3,000 feet, perhaps 1,000 feet above the cloud layer.
Just taking things easy.
Yes. Then one of my men said that he saw 2 aircrafts going through a cloud 3 miles away on our beam. I switched off the automatic pilot and took over the controls. All of a sudden, 2 Junkers 88 burst out of the clouds 1,500 yards on our beam. I dove towards the clouds, but the German fighters attacked right into our starboard beam. They opened fire at 1,200 yards, and I turned into them to give them a full deflection shot. But the first plane was right on and raked us with 50 caliber and cannon shells from stem to stern. My top turret and tail gunners were throwing lead into the Jerry, but we don't know whether we got him.
Were any of you wounded by those cannon shells?
Not one of us. Our instruments were smashed, and the plane was riddled from end to end. My voice gunner had his microphone shot out of his hand. One of the boys had his heating cord shot away, and another had a bullet through his sleeve of his flying suit, so close that it burned his arm, but no one was hurt. The worst thing was that number 1 engine was out of action, and we couldn't feather the propeller. That set up a drag, and we were skidding along sideways at 1,100 feet, with a compass that had been shot to bits.
Not a very pretty predicament.
We jettisoned our bombs and threw our excess gear overboard, but we sank down to 300 feet. I was flying by instruments in the clouds at a full skid, the damnedest flying I ever hoped to do. The stream of oil started coming out of number 4 engine, and after 3/4 of an hour, the oil pressure dropped, number 4 engine was finished. Then I knew we'd have to land at sea, so I ordered the crew to brace themselves for ditching. There wasn't any heavy groundswell, so we went upwind into a 12 or 15 knot breeze and made a full stall landing. The tail hit, and the co-pilot cut the other 2 motors. The first time we hit was bad, but the second one was like hitting a brick wall in a car going at 100 miles an hour. It ripped the bottom out of our plane, and the nose went underwater and mashed it in at a 45-degree angle. Water tore off the top of the cockpit, and the plane broke in 2 just after the bomb bays. The co-pilot and I were both stunned, but we managed to get through the water that filled the inside of the aircraft and climb out through the broken top of the cockpit. 2 of the boys got out the wing rafts, and the co-pilot dragged me to one and stuck me on it. 5 of the boys in the after section of the plane got out. two through the break, and the others through the hatches. One boy was stuck, and another boy went back to get him. They all floated on big oxygen bottles and finally reached the raft.
Well, how many of you got out of the plane?
9 out of 11. I've been told that that's the largest number ever to get out of a Liberator forced down at sea. The wings are high, and the body of the plane takes all the shock. Our radioman, Robert Erdman of San Marino, California, and Thomas Ryan of Louisville, Kentucky, had sent out a message that we were attacked, and they kept sending SOSs when we lost our one engine. So the shore stations got fixes on us and knew where we were. Then they sent out the last message that we were ditching. Both men stayed at their jobs in the radio compartment, and both men were lost. It was dark by this time, and we didn't dare take the raft too close to the plane because the wings would have cut them up, and we would have lost everyone then. The wings stayed afloat for only about 5 minutes.
You must have been pretty well played out.
We were all exhausted, and one man was badly injured. It was cold in the open sea on a winter night. The sea was rough, and the waves kept breaking right over us. We had some emergency rations and very pistol, but no water. Twice it rained, and the cold was awful. The injured man died sometime during the night. One man had lost his shoes, so we all huddled together, and I lay with my face on his bare foot, trying to keep it warm. The other foot was frostbitten, but the foot I lay on was all right.
Were you in any danger of swamping?
Yes, the waves kept breaking over us. They seemed to go right through us, we were so cold. We bailed all night, and perhaps that kept us from freezing. Once during the night we saw light, but by the time we could get the very pistol loaded and fire a flare, the light had disappeared. When dawn broke, the sea looked very empty, and we were at least 50 or 60 miles from shore. At 9:30 we saw a plane, but it was too far away. Then for an hour we waited, and then another plane came. I waited until it got a beam of us, then I fired a parachute flare. The plane was a Royal Air Force Sunderland out searching for us. He dropped smoke lights and circled us until we were picked up. At 11:30, though, a Catalina from our base arrived at our last known position, which was given him from the radio message that we had sent. It was only 3 miles away from the position where we were. The Sunderland dropped us another raft because ours had sprung a leak. Finally, 2 Hurricanes arrived and circled around us to protect us from enemy air attack.
Sounds like quite a gathering.
It certainly was. All those planes going round and round us. The Catalina wanted to land, but I thought it was too rough, so I warned him off. At 3 o'clock, we saw 2 boats racing towards us.
Did you say racing towards you?
Yes. One was an RAF air-sea rescue launch, and the other was a British Navy craft. The RAF launch was the faster. It beat the Royal boat by about 200 yards. The RAF boat started to take us aboard, and the Navy came up and asked if they couldn't have at least one survivor. But we all got aboard the air-sea rescue launch. I don't remember much that happened then, except some dry underwear, blankets, hot soup, brandy, and a warm bunk. Back in England, we went to the hospital because we all had some cuts and minor injuries. The most fed-up boy of the bunch, though, was one who found out an order had come through for him to leave for the States the previous day, the day we had set out on our patrol. But he didn't see the order until we got back to the base, after it was all over.
Thank you, Lieutenant Wright. Sub-hunting in the Bay of Biscay doesn't sound like a very soft job. After 600 hours of operational flying over both oceans, you ought to know. This is John McVeigh in London, returning you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
You have been listening to War Telescope, a weekly report on the war as seen from London by John McVeigh, NBC's veteran observer in the British capital. Mr. McVeigh is presented each Saturday at this same time over most of these stations. This program has come to you from London and New York. This is
London, the National Broadcasting Company presents War Telescope, a review of the war week and a forecast of possible developments to come. War Telescope features John McVeigh of NBC's London staff, a veteran reporter of the European scene. For his regular Saturday report, we take you now to London.
This is John McVeigh in London. A huge force of American fortresses and liberators flew out from Britain today to strike at targets in southern Germany. It stated that they were escorted by fighters in very great strength. Among the objectives bombed were aircraft plants, airfields, and other war industries. It's probable that today's flight was one of the Americans' deepest penetrations into Germany, and thought that nearly 2,000 planes, possibly half of them fighters, took part in this great attack. Britain is in a period of waiting just now. You might almost compare it to the minutes just before a horse race when people look over the runners and make last-minute bets. Little things that happen in those last minutes are regarded for their effect on the race. If a cloud appears in the sky, people wonder about rain on the track. If a horse shies, people wonder whether he'll shy as the barrier goes up. I think that much of what's happening in the world these recent days is being scanned anxiously by British eyes, not for itself, but for its effects on the great race, the entry of the Allied armies into Europe. All thinking is dominated by the concrete fact that on some unknown day, the whole strength of the American and British armies is going to be at grips with the German army. And in the military and diplomatic signs, observers here strain desperately to read the auguries of the future, the immediate future of battle and the more distant future of peace. Take the casino bombing for one instance. Heavy bombers were shifted to work that had usually been considered in the province of the medium bombers. According to the theory that had been generally accepted, commanders use heavy bombers to deliver crushing blows on big objectives, ports, cities, and factories far behind the enemy lines. To blast his defense positions, the low-flying, more accurate mediums are usually employed. At Casino, the long hold-up had evidently decided the commanders to use extraordinary means. The heavy bombers roared out to dump their huge bomb loads on the whole area of the German defenses. British papers gave big headlines to the exploit, and many thousands of words of eyewitness descriptions were published. But the results were evidently unsatisfactory, for after it was all over, Allied infantrymen were still fighting their way through Casino. German defenders had crouched in their dugouts. Bomb craters and debris helped hold up the attackers. And those Germans who weren't killed popped up to give Allied infantry their same old job, the hardest job in war bar none, walking up to enemy machine gun posts and putting them out of action. Now, the average Britisher has become something of a military tactician. And the question he's asking today is, what does the Casino bombing prove that will help the second front? Probably it proves what's been proved before, that in spite of all the high explosive and the loud noises, bombing by itself is not enough to knock out determined infantry in good defensive positions. And the stories from Casino of artillery and anti-tank guns sliding out of the mouths of caves to fire, then sliding back before they can be hit, recall vividly the caves on the cliff face at Dieppe and the German 75s that slid out, fired, and slid back. Casino's problem is one that will obviously have to be mastered as a necessary first step into Europe. Without being a prophet, anyone who's ever seen German defenses knows they'll be well constructed and well sighted. We can be sure that the Germans will fight desperately, but we know also that once they're convinced they're cut off and beaten, they'll surrender quickly. Like the rolling artillery barrage in this or the last war, the problem of aiding by bomb or shell your most important soldier, the infantryman, is largely one of timing. Intrepid and well-trained infantrymen, with confidence in their gunners, can work closely behind a creeping barrage of artillery fire that for a brief space of time keeps enemy defenders down in their dugouts. But if too many minutes elapse between the barrage that rains on the defense posts and the moment the infantryman can toss his grenade into the machine gun crew, the Germans can raise their heads and start firing with disastrous results. Casino seems to prove that infantry can't work very closely behind the bombs from high-flying heavy bombers, which are accurate only for an area. That's something that will have to be taken into account. But the heavy bombers are doing other work, great work, that inspires the British with confidence in the coming offensive. The huge smashes by day and night, like today, against German cities, the fact that heavy bombers can now attack Germany from Italian bases, and a great air pincer, have given rise to the hope that when our armies do move, they will at least have the advantage of air cover. And air cover, if not all important to battle-hardened soldiers, is extremely important to troops going into their first action. With air cover, an army can move faster than without air cover. And speed is going to be the factor that will win or lose many battles in the days to come. And the British feel that the heavy bombing of Germany will squeeze off the flow of supplies available for German armies in both East and West. And perhaps it's good insurance for future peace to blast into the German mentality that they can't henceforth make war without paying the penalty on their own soil. There are other recent developments that have been looked upon here for their future rather than their present effect. Slight diplomatic incidents through these past weeks have convinced most serious observers here that there's a lack of cohesion in the diplomatic activity of the three larger allies, America, Russia, and Britain. You get the feeling here that Washington has recently taken unilateral action in several diplomatic spheres to which the British have agreed, but later, The most immediate points that spring to mind are the Saudi Arabian oil scheme, the sudden statement on the Argentine affair, and finally the era decision. Then came Russia's announcement that an envoy was being accredited to Badoglio. Again, an example of unilateral action that's not important for itself, but for the future. Some sources here defend the Russian action on the ground that the Allied Control Commission had visited Italy only once or twice and had done little or nothing to help or hinder the straightening out of the involved Italian political situation. It's explained that the Russians felt they could get both information and action from their own representative with Badoglio that wasn't possible through the Vega channels of the Control Commission. It seems incredible to observers here that in spite of all goodwill and the realization that the three countries must have more than a casual working partnership to achieve victory and maintain some sort of order between the nations, we still haven't reached the stage where we can work in close diplomatic harmony, the stage where we can sit down and plan things out together ahead of time. The trial of Pucher, former Vichy Minister of the Interior, is another point that's been closely watched in Britain as a straw to indicate the future on the continent. It's been interesting to note that in the mixed British comments on the trial lies a failure to understand how deep is the political passion that governs continental thought. And in the trial of Pucher, we can see the coming trials of the German war chiefs and their quislings. They will be political trials, for as one London review aptly said, how else can they be tried where the judges must decide without known laws to guide them what is crime and treason and what is not? One of Britain's ablest political writers, reviewing the case anonymously in the left-wing Tribune, says, the head of Pucher is the warning symbol to all who doubt or fear it that those who would have led France and Europe into eternal slavery 2 or 3 years ago shall not regain their mastery. The hopes and dreams of the common people, no less than their justice, pronounce that verdict. So the British wonder what the trial of Pucher means as an indication of the greater trials and condemnations of the men who've been responsible for a world's suffering. For the word guilty, condemned to death, is a word that will be heard in many courts in many lands before Europe regains its freedom. Meanwhile, the Germans have been doing little to avert the coming blow. In their propaganda, observers can detect signs of growing uneasiness, signs that the combination of the big air raids, the worsening situation on the Russian front, and the tottering position of such satellite nations as Finland, Romania, and Bulgaria have impressed on the Germans that the clock has come to a late minute of the 11th hour. A few small raids on London make up Germany's only active retaliation. And that's not retaliation of a type to cause the slightest hindrance to the war effort. London's great bulk absorbs bombs without much trace. There's even some pride here that London is using up German planes that might otherwise be used against our invasion push. For most of the American troops in Britain, the recent London air raids have been the first real taste of war. Bombs, fires, and the anti-aircraft barrage have been something new. And thousands of Americans on leave in this British capital have gone out in the streets to watch the display. For the American military police, who control all American soldiers in London, the raids have been something of a headache. The military police, in their bright white helmets and leggings, have had to shepherd rubbernecking soldiers into shelters, fight fires, carry furniture out of burning houses, and help the British bobbies with street traffic. They've also treated casualties, cleared debris, along with their usual work of seeing that American soldiers don't get into trouble in the big city. A pretty big job. So today, I thought you might like to hear a couple of American military policemen tell you about it themselves. They're Private Forrest Snyder of Allentown, Pennsylvania, and Private First Class Hollis E. Sutton of McMinnville, Tennessee. You did a little firefighting the other night, didn't you, Private Snyder?
Yes. Some of the MPs worked in quite a few fires that night. I saw a little flame burning inside a room in the locked office building. I broke in and went up to the room. I used the 3 buckets of water I found on the floor, but I couldn't put it out. If I had help at that moment, I think we could have saved the house. By the time I got some other soldiers, 3 floors were burning. It was too late. All we could do was to go in and save some of the furniture.
And what did you do, Private Sutton?
At one part, my job was to keep people moving, keep them away from the forest so the firemen could work. Burning pieces of building were falling all around, and I had a hard time keeping soldiers and the rest away from the danger area.
Now, what other jobs do American MPs do in air raids?
Just be ready to help the British civil defense workers any way we can. For instance, in our barracks we have an emergency rescue squad always on duty. If the British rescue squad need extra help anywhere in our neighborhood, we have trained men ready to go.
What about your ordinary jobs?
We tell soldiers how to get to where they want to go in London.
We had special instructions on London streets, the places of interest, restaurants, and Red Cross clubs. But in these London blackouts at night, it's not easy to find your way around, even for an MP.
Say a soldier is causing trouble. How do you work with a regular London policeman?
Bobbies can hold an American soldier, but not press charges against him. What happens is that the London policeman holds the man who is causing the trouble and gets in touch with us. We take him away and our own army authorities deal with him.
Some of your men are on traffic work, aren't they?
Yes. They take American convoys through the London area, check up on speeding and parking of American military vehicles, just like the ordinary police at home.
We keep radios installed by Scotland Yard, and we can get a pickup to any scene of trouble within 3 minutes.
And what other kinds of work do you do?
We've had regular combat training with infantry weapons, as well as special courses in street fighting and judo. That's rough and tumble jiu-jitsu. Back in the States, we had foreign language courses, so we know enough to run traffic and administer areas that the Army occupies.
Incendiary bombs weren't exactly new, because we had been trained at home on how to deal with them. We know something about first aid, too.
You're almost jacks of all trades, aren't you? I suppose most of you were policemen in civil life, so you had something to begin on.
Not at all. I was a machinist. Certain was a farmer and nursery worker. In fact, I know of only one MP who used to be a policeman.
And yet you have one of the toughest and most important police jobs in the world. I know from experience how vital will be the work of the MPs with our invasion force. I've seen them directing traffic under shell fire, pointing the way to headquarters and other points, keeping trucks and tanks moving so they don't form a target for enemy bombing, guarding prisoners, all in all, doing key work in the great task of keeping an army rolling ahead. And this Allied invasion army that's readying here will roll ahead in an amphibious attack that should occupy an important place in history. It'll be a new phase in Britain's military career. For hundreds of years, the British have preferred the roundabout method of small armies moving along sea lines of communication they control. And this coming attack will be far huger than anything America has ever known. But with experienced leaders, well-trained troops, and gigantic stocks of war materials, the outcome should not be in doubt, however high the price we pay. This is John McVeigh in London, returning you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
You have been listening to War Telescope. War Telescope is a weekly report on the war, as seen from London by John McVeigh, NBC's veteran observer in the British capital. Mr. McVeigh is presented each Saturday at this same time over most of these stations. In addition to his regular weekly report, Mr. McVeigh today presented an interview with an American MP serving in England. War Telescope is a review of the war week and a forecast of possible developments to come. Remember to listen next Saturday at this same time over most of these stations to War Telescope. This is the National Broadcasting Company.